Hello, musicians. Welcome to another episode of Explore Great Music with Ted. Today we'll focus on the fourth and final movement of Dvorak's New World Symphony. Let's jump right in and explore the score. The fourth movement begins with a rising scale over the dominant of E minor. Oops! That was the fugue from Bach's Prelude and Fugue in E minor. Let's start over with Dvorak, shall we? As I was saying, the fourth movement opens with a brief introduction on the dominant of E minor, where the strings play a rising scale-wise figure. That leads up to the exposition on the next page. The principal theme is 8 measures long, consisting of 2 phrases, A and A prime, where those phrases have sub-phrases little a and b and little a and c, respectively. The trumpets double the third and fourth horns, while the rest of the orchestra punctuates with chords. The principal theme repeats, with the first trumpet playing an octave higher. The chordal accompaniment by the rest of the orchestra is embellished by arpeggiated figures in the strings. Phrase B of the principal theme comes next, and it is composed of 2 4-measure subphrases, little a and little a. Notice that the upper strings play the melody in faux bourdon, a compositional technique that goes back as far as the 15th century. The A phrase returns, played in the highest register by the first violins and doubled by the winds, while the second violins and violas play arpeggiated tremolos. This gives way to a 4-measure extension where motifs P and Q progress to double time and devolve to motif Q only. The transition section follows next, where theme T begins with 2 3-measure phrases, A and A prime. These phrases consist of 3 1-measure subphrases, little a, b, and c. Let's pause and note a few things here. Subphrase B is particularly important since it will reappear in the first secondary section. The triplet figures in subphrases A and C will make appearances later in the development and coda. All 4 horns play an oompa-oompa accompaniment. And let's not lose track of the modulation during phrase A, which moves from 1 to 5 of 3, which for the record is motion down a whole step from E minor to D major. The B phrase of T is 2 identical 2-measure phrases punctuated by hammer blows exchanged between the timpani and first violins. Phrases A and A prime repeat, at which point subphrase B takes over, expanding its range first upward then downward and modulating towards the dominant of G major. Listen on the next page for the solo by the cymbals. This is the only use of the cymbals in this movement, and indeed the entire symphony. The first secondary theme emerges from the clarinet, which hovers above tremolo chords in the upper strings. Also notice the quiet strokes of the timpani here. These will show up again to dramatic effect in the coda. Now underneath the clarinets, we hear the cellos with a figure derived from TAB. SAA repeats immediately. At this point, there is a clever modulation to F major down a whole step. Pay attention to the delicate filler melody played by the first flute here. On the next page, we return immediately to G major with a soaring melody in the first violins, accompanied by figures in the cellos and basses derived from TAB. Notice also the chromatic figure that creeps in, played by the clarinet, bassoon, and violas. While the first violins continue the melody with a series of appoggiaturas, another chromatic accompaniment appears underneath in the second oboe and second violins. This gives way to the second secondary section, where the first violins have a joyous march doubled by the flutes. Underneath this, there is a martial accompaniment by the trumpets and timpani. Again, notice that chromatic countermelody in S2AB, played by the clarinets and violas. In the second measure of S2AB, we see motif Z, soon to become important in the closing section of the exposition, and then in the development. The B phrase of S2 follows a repeat of S2A, and there is much to notice here. The cellos and basses switch to a syncopated figure, while the second violins and violas play colorful string-crossing arpeggios. For something really subtle, notice how at the end of this page and the beginning of the next, the trombones, tuba, and timpani punctuate accompaniment with quarter notes every 3 beats, forming a brief passage of polyrhythm 3/4 against 4/4. A closing section begins on the next page, an optional feature of sonata form that Dvorak did not exploit in the first movement. Motif Z, which showed up in S2AB, is now repeated across 12 measures, consisting of K phrases A, B, and A. This is followed by an extension where the bassoon countermelody based on motif Z continues for 4 measures until giving way to 6 measures of pentatonic pizzicato in the lower strings, doubled by the clarinets and bassoon. Wow, there's a lot of music there, and Dvorak is just getting warmed up. So let's summarize what we've learned so far. This is the exposition of a sonata form that has a brief introduction, primary and transition sections, 2 secondary sections, and a closing section. Modulations down a whole step appear twice, first in the primary section from E minor to D major, and second in the first secondary section from G major to F major. There are multiple themes that will play important roles throughout the rest of the movement. These include the principal theme, PA, the transition theme, TA, the boisterous and martial second secondary theme, S2A, the closing theme, KA, whose 3-note motif acts as an ostinato for 12 measures. The development section begins with the flutes and oboes playing the Z motif in parallel thirds, an octave apart. 4 measures later, PAA is played by all 4 horns with an inflection towards G natural minor. This whole passage starts again, but instead of repeating exactly, the 4 horns repeat PAA, but this time inflecting towards and arriving in E minor. Here begins section 2 of the development, where PAA is played by the cellos and basses in diminution, alternating with TAA in the first violins. The underlying harmony morphs into a dominant 7th of the Neapolitan, and sure enough, we arrive in F major to begin section 3. The violas play a figure derived from PAA and diminution, which serves as the substrate over which Dvorak brings back PAA of the second movement in the flutes and clarinet, and the X motif from the scherzo of the third movement. Harmonically, this modulates immediately up a half step to F sharp major. The sequence continues on the next page, moving up yet another half step to G major. Now perseverating on G major, the orchestra builds up to a deceptive cadence where the trumpets and trombones arrive with PAA from the second movement in E flat major. This passage is repeated, now in E flat major, but this time the statement by the trumpets and trombones is in E flat minor and marks the arrival of development section 4. Already in the first measure of this section, we see that PAA of this movement is played by the cellos and basses while the winds simultaneously play the same theme in diminution all over a 5/7 of E minor. Now PAA from the first movement is quoted by the low strings doubled by horns and bassoons, ushering in the fifth section of the development, now in a dominant of G minor. The principal themes of the first and fourth movement alternate, then give way to the fourth movement melody and diminution, which fragments until reaching 1/6/4 of G minor, where this movement's principal theme is played by the trumpets, first and second horns. This is extended with the second subphrase PAB, which builds over a 1/6/4 in G minor, until suddenly veering back to 5/7 of 5 of E minor, and the arrival of the recapitulation, where the trombones and tuba return dramatically to this movement's principal theme. As just before, the theme is extended by 2 measures with a repeat of PAB. Against this, the entire orchestra plays syncopated chords, and note that the pattern in the second 2 measures is not the same as the first 2 measures. As you can see, the recapitulation is all of 6 measures on 1/6/4 of E minor. As a side note, we saw here that the modulation went from G minor to E minor. Recall that in the exposition of the first movement, the modulation during the transition section went from E minor to G minor. A transition section follows, beginning with PAA and PAB in the oboes and horns. PAB is accompanied by measured tremolos in the violas. On the next page, we see that Dvorak achieves a mood of calm after the storm by repeating PAB in the first violins, which repeats each measure down a third to the accompaniment of the measured tremolos, now in the basses. Let's pause for a moment and listen to this passage. And then let's allow our thoughts to drift back to the beginning of the symphony. And then let's allow our thoughts to drift back to the beginning of the symphony. All the way back to the introduction in the first movement, we can see that Dvorak, consciously or unconsciously, was foreshadowing this passage in the fourth movement, and in particular the theme on which this passage is based. Returning to the end of the transition section of the recapitulation, we see that the modulations down by thirds has brought us to a D-flat major chord in first inversion, and harmonically, this is 5/6 of 5 of 5 of E, which resolves to 5 of 5 and lands on a 5/7 in E major, marking the beginning of the first secondary section. Many times during this symphony, we have seen shifts directly between the minor and parallel major. Here we followed an elaborate and interesting path to achieve the same thing. The melody is played by the first violins, who then hand off to the cellos for the second phrase. There is a new counter melody in the bassoon, and this is similarly passed to the first horn. The leaping motif of TAB also returns here, now in the flute and oboe, above the melody. On the next page, we see that just as in the exposition, the A' phrase of S1 modulates down a whole step, here from E major to D major. Meanwhile, the first clarinet plays a counter melody, while the cellos vary the melody by leaping up an octave, adding expressiveness and warmth here. Doubled by the flutes and oboes, the first violins play the B phrase of S2, which is slightly altered from the exposition, notably by the chromatic line from C sharp to C to B. Recall also that this is the section where we saw the chromatic inner voices in the exposition. S2 now follows, but note how the mood is entirely different from the exposition. In the exposition, this was a boisterous march. Here, it has the serenity of a quiet sunset. The B phrase of S2 is played by the flute and oboe, and a new counter melody is given to the bassoon. When the B phrase repeats, notice how the flutes add soft color to the passage, with the syncopation on G sharp above the diminished seventh chord below. The beginning of the closing section is announced by the solo first horn, which plays the first movement principal theme, shifted by a quarter of a measure to the right. The third and fourth horns add a nice touch at the end by dropping down to the pedal tone on low E. Suddenly, there is a flourish in the first and second horns based on the Z motif, and this rushes to a loud return of PA from the first movement, launching the coda as the horns and trombones play PAA of the fourth movement over a 1/6/4 in E minor. As PAB is played twice, it is combined with TAA in the strings, martial figures in the trumpets, and oompa in the bassoon's third and fourth horns. The hysterics are magnified by the mordents in the winds. A 1/7 chord in E minor leads up to section 2, where the trombones play PAA from the first movement over a deceptive cadence, C major first inversion. The dramatic entrance of the trumpets prepares the suspension to be resolved on the next page. Preceded by chromatic lines in the inner voices, the violins return to PAA of this movement in diminution, and 4 measures of build-up in the whole orchestra over 5 of E minor prepares us to expect final chords and the end of the movement. But not so fast. Instead of finishing the symphony, Dvorak launches into section 3 of the coda with a surprising return of the chorale from the second movement. Dvorak's inner Mahler comes out in the hammer strokes by the timpani. The final cadence here is F major to E minor, which produces highly disguised parallel fifths and octaves. The orchestra quiets down quickly on the next page, yielding to section 4 of the coda. Here, the clarinets perseverate on the principal theme of the second movement, while in the background, the X motif from the third movement is passed down through the strings, ending in the timpani. The X motif is reduced to a series of 2 eighth note figures that recall the commentary by the timpani in S1 of the exposition. Section 5 begins with a mournful reprise of PAA in the horns, who follow with PAB in augmentation. Note the harmonic progression here, E minor to D major, back to E minor. Arpeggiated tremolos in the strings bring forth a pleading PAA in unison and octaves in the strings and winds, followed again by PAB in augmentation over a D major chord. I encourage you to let me know in the comments if you can think of any other passages in 19th century music where one will find this cadence, 1 to flat 7 to 1. Section 6 will bring the symphony to a close in E major. Dvorak concludes here with one more compositional flourish. Start by hearing the principal theme of the first movement played by the trombones, while the trumpets simultaneously play the principal theme of this movement. Note the appoggiatura in the trumpets, horns, and oboe, where F sharp resolves to E sharp. I find this screaming chord truly astonishing. Layered over an E major chord, we have D natural, E sharp, G sharp, and C natural. The phrase is repeated, and then the orchestra takes off headlong towards the end, starting with alternations of E major and the screaming chord. Finally, we've reached the end, where the low strings and trombones play a pentatonic figure before arriving at the final chords of E major. And in one last surprise for us, Dvorak adds a fermata marked lunga to the last chord in the winds. Well, musicians, there you have it. This concludes our deep dive into the score of the last movement of Dvorak's New World Symphony. We recognize the returns of themes from the three previous movements, as Dvorak wove them in along with new themes in this movement. We were surprised by the reappearance of the chorale in the coda, and we encountered a dissonant screaming chord just before the happy ending. I hope our study of all four movements of the New World Symphony enhances your appreciation of this piece and spurs you to do your own analyses of other music that you know and love. As always, I'd love to hear from you, so please leave your thoughts and questions in the comments section. If you found the annotations helpful and enjoyed the commentary, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye for now.